Brigade's. Okay, this is actually not a bad one to teach off of. This is a deck that's not really in the meta anymore, but oh, let me fix my screen real quick. I didn't realize it's not a filter. No. Scale. No. Transform. What is that? Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. All right. So ignore the one of symbols and the medium run ratio. This is an older deck profile. It doesn't have any meta relevancy right now. But so the thought process behind this deck, right, is you have to really look at what the deck consists of and what the deck wants to do, right? So this card is a 1-card starter, right? So I can send this card from my hand or the field, and then at that point I can send one level 3 or lower beast from my deck to graveyard. So what this deck wants to do is it wants to start with either this card, which is Fractal, or it wants to start with Kit, right? So because these are my starter cards, I want to run these at 3, because 3 in Yugioh is a card that you want to see in your opening hand every time. So I want to see Fractal in my opening hand every time. I want to see Rescue Cat in my opening hand every time. I want to see Kit in my hand opening every time. I want to see Nerval in my hand every time. So I have these 2 starter cards, right? Though those I pretty much want to see in my hand every time. So those have to be at 3. This is just an extender. Extenders are typically ran at 2 because you don't want to see them in your opening hand, or they're searchable. And so to free up the math behind the statistical probability of you opening those cards, you would bump it down to 2. And if I'm speaking too big word, please let me know. I can be throwing a lot of words at the wall, and if you don't understand it, you don't understand it. So this card, a lot of people will run at 1. This card is searchable, so typically this is going to be ran at 1. This hand trap is ran at 1 because it's searchable in the engine, right? And so to free up space for other hand traps or other response cards, because this is searchable, I'm not going to run this at 3. In any other deck, this would be ran at 3, so that way you have the highest statistical probability of opening this in your opening hand, right? Droll, pretty common hand trap. It's really meta relevant. It's really strong, right? So, like I said, this deck list is out of date. This is before they put Tanky back at 3. So the ban list also plays a huge factor in deck building. So at the time that I was running this deck in the game, Tanky was at 2, right? It just got bumped up to 2 from 1. So I was running 2, which put this deck at a 41 card deck, right? Because statistically, everything else was at a perfect ratio at the time. And so the only logical thing for me to do was to just slide in an extra copy, right? Adding 1 extra card is negligible in statistics of how you generate a card. Let me see if I can find the website. Card TCG card statistics, card pull statistics by ratio, something like that. There's a calculator online. TCG deck builder calculator by ratio. Ah, here we go. It's actually a perfect website. Yu-Gi-Oh! Probability calculator. Alright, so in a 41 card deck, and your hand size is 5. Right? Let's say, Tanky, right? That was the card I was just talking about. We have it at 3. I have a 33.76% chance of opening that card in my opening hand, right? So that card by itself has a 33% chance. That is a 1-card starter, right? So I play that card, it's an open spell, and I can add 1 level 4 or lower monster to my deck, right? From my deck to my hand. What are all my main engine cards? They're all level 4 or lower beast cards, right? Oh, this one's specifically Beast Warrior, right? My bad. Correction. So this card searches up Fractal, right? That means Fractal is not at a ratio of 3 in this deck. It is now at a ratio of 5. So if I bump this number up to 5, right? I now have a 50-50 shot of opening Fractal in my opening hand. And I want that card in my opening hand because that is an effect that's not a summon, right? So I want to be able to open this card in my opening hand. So I'm going to adjust the ratio through spell effects or monster effects to make sure I have this card as best as possible. So this is my starter. This is my starter. So I have starter, starter, starter. I also have Foolish Burial as another starter, and I have 1-for-1 as another starter. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 starter cards. And that isn't even getting into Rescue Cat. That's a whole nother beast into itself. So that's 10 cards that can start my deck, right? And this deck really cares about the graveyard, so it doesn't care if those cards get negated or they get destroyed on summon or any of that, right? So it's all about the specific archetype of the deck that you're playing with. Here's a regionals list. All right, so this is pretty similar to the deck list that I was just playing on Master Duel. This was a deck list that I took to a regional a year and a half ago. So I'll explain my reasoning behind certain ratios in this deck specifically, right? So this card, I never want to see it, right? This card specifically is in there for one specific purpose, and it's typically only relevant if I dump it from deck to grave. Sometimes I draw it, which is fine. It's not horrible if I draw it. I can get the deck started with it. It's just not ideal to have it in my opening hand, so I have it at 1. The Shuda is pretty decent at 1. Pretty decent in my opening hand. I really want to see a Shuna or a Hara in my opening hand, which is why they're at 3. But Shuda is just a good one to have, so it's there. You can ignore the Gamma driver. That's just hand trap stuff. So, actually, no, that's actually a great point to get into. So, with Gamma, right? So Gamma cannot be normal summoned or set, right? So it's just in your hand unless you use it or you discard it. But this card, when you special summon it off of its effect to get the negate for a monster, it has to summon itself. Like, it is mandatory to summon itself with a driver. The problem is driver is a brick. It's garnet. It's terrible. You never want to see this card in your hand. If this card is in your hand and you don't have a Gamma in hand, it's just a brick, right? It's terrible. You don't want to have it, which is why it's at 1. So before Gamma got limited to 1 in the TCG and 2 on Master Duels, you would run 3 Gammas for 1 driver, because if you're not using this early game, right, you're never going to use it. So it didn't matter if you just bricked and had another Gamma later in the game. Like, it didn't matter, right? Because you were just trying to set up your opening hand to where you could use that Gamma without breaking on the driver. So this was the perfect ratio of running 3 Gammas, so that way you would open it in your opening hand, so you had response to your opponent, to 1 driver, so you would never open it, but it was there to fulfill the summoning requirements for Gamma. Yeah, side deck choices, all that. The extra deck is where things get tricky, right? So, same thing with the main deck main engine monsters for this deck, right? Taya at 2, because you don't want to see it in your opening hand, but you want to see it at some point. Moyi is a starter. Long Yon is a starter. Blackout is searchable off of Chichao, so you run it at 1, because you really don't want to. you only really need one copy because you can search it up. Emergence at 3, even though you can only use it once per turn. It's searchable. If you have a second in your opening hand, it's not a big deal. You can discard it for Long Yawn's effect, or you can reveal it for Mogi's effect, which is why it's ran at 3 specifically, because it's very useful. Pot of Desires is ran at 2 specifically because in the TCG at the time it was limited to 2. Now I would probably leave it at 2. You could bump it up to 3. I can see an argument for it, but personally, I think 2 is the perfect ratio for this deck. Because if you run it at 3 and then you draw 3 in a game, that's in a 40 card deck, that's literally your entire deck gone. And you can't even activate this if you don't have 10 cards in your deck left. So 2 is the perfect ratio. You really don't want to go lower than that. No, you don't want to go higher than that. Correction. Yeah. So if you're new to the game, I highly recommend getting a playset of Infinite Impermanences and a playset of Ash Blossoms first, and then get you a Call by the Grave too. It's just an amazing card. It's a counter hand trap card basically, but it's also very versatile in a lot of other aspects too. These 7 cards will probably get played in like every deck. It's very rare that you will not have these at some point in your deck. Ash Blossom, there's very few times that it's not relevant to the meta. D-Shifter in the TCG right now is very meta relevant. A lot of decks really want to play Undershifter, and it really messes up a lot of the other decks, so learn how to play with that. But yeah, that's the main deck. I think the principles are pretty solid. Feel free to ask any questions on that if you have any. But for the extra deck specifically, right, it all depends on what you're trying to do, right? Like, this is a boss monster of the deck. I only want to run it at 1 because it's a 12 drop level, and it's really hard to make. And so if I run 2, it's going to clog up the extra deck. So I'll run it at 1. Baron de Floor is a level 10, but you only want to run it at 1 specifically because you make it on your first turn if you're going first. And if you don't go first, you don't want to make it. You want to make a different boss monster. And so instead of making that, you want to go into Quixing, right? And so the level 10s I'm running at 1 specifically because if you run any more of them, it just clogs up the extra deck that you can use for more utility stuff. Like Boxia. Boxia is an amazing card to get around Nibiru, right? And so you use this card as this very specific utility extra deck card to get around play so you continue playing. This one is ran at 2 specifically for certain situations. But Chichao is ran at 2 because theoretically you can make Chichao. Correction, I'm bumbling. So the reason why Chichao is ran at 2 is because turn 1 you are always going to make Chichao, right? The second one there is for an additional starter in case, not in case, in the very likely scenario that the immediate next turn your opponent is going to get rid of it, or you have to get rid of it off of a different effect, like Blackout. So that is to give you another starter. The reason why Monk of the Tinny is ran at 2 is specifically because of Shaman of the Tinny. If we weren't running this card, you could probably cut that card down to 1 because it's mostly just there for your Tinny monsters to have a non-effect monster on field, so that way they can special summon themselves and do their effects in grave. So you probably would want to leave that at 2 anyways, but what's great about that is you can go into, like, let's say you have a monk and I don't know if you were in my match a few minutes ago, but I had a situation where I had a monk and then I drew like an Adharo and an Ashuna, right? So I could special summon that Ashuna, and then I could take that Ashuna and that monk and go into Shaman, discard a card, and then bring back a worm monster from grave. I brought back a boss monster, won the game with it, right? So there's a lot of utility in a lot of different things, but learning the extra deck and what ratios should go in the extra deck is a skill unto its own outside of deck building. The main deck is a lot easier to build than you think it is. The core of the deck does not change between deck lists. Pretty much everybody's going to run the same ratio of the main deck monsters because Yu-Gi-Oh! Pros have very fine-tuned how to craft deck building over the last decade. And so the core of the deck, my best advice you can do is to take that core that someone else has put in competitive work into, lay it into a program like Dueling Book, lay it in, figure out what your ratios are, right? Learn that. That'll also come with your extra deck monsters. And then from there, you can throw in all of your different side, like your different side deck and tech cards. So this is where you would throw your imperms and your ashes. And you know that this format, everybody wants to do a lot of graveyard stuff. So you'll throw in shifters so that way they don't have graveyard. This format is very spell heavy, so I'm going to run Cosmic Cyclones inside. I'm going to run Dark Ruler No More instead of Forbidden Droplet this format because I get better utility off of this card rather than Forbidden Droplet. Or, you know, I think if you can start with understanding the ratios of cards and why you would want to pick 3 or 2 or 1 of a card, I think everything else will come to you after that. I wouldn't concern myself too much on the tech side with like the hand traps and stuff. You'll figure that out as you go, but just pick a deck list you like, pick something that seems fun, and then just go from there. Yeah, no problem. I love getting people into Yu-Gi-Oh. I used to help teach people at my locals before I moved last year how to play the game and how to get into it. So I'm very passionate about this game, and I will always help people learn how to get into it. If you ever have any more questions on deck building or anything like that, hit me up. I don't mind. This game is very unapproachable for new players these days because of how complex it is. And so if I can take a few minutes out of my time and break things down so people can understand it better, I'm more than willing to do that.